So this unit will cover the settlement of the West following the Civil War. So in this unit, we will look at why settlers moved to the West, how movement to the West impacted various groups such as Native Americans, and also political change that was brought on by settlement in the West. Our first section will cover why people moved west, various ways that they moved west, how life in the West was for those who settled there. Our essential question is what factors encouraged Americans to move west after the Civil War, and what was life like for the settlers? So one of the groups that moved west were miners. Y'all are familiar with the California Gold Rush, which began in 1849. But in many other Western states, there were also precious metals discovered, and people who rushed out to those Western states hoping to strike it rich. So there were discoveries of gold in other places, as well as other precious metals, and these occurred in every Western territories, bringing settlers there. So we see on this wagon up here, Pikes Peak or bust. That was a common phrase associated with the Colorado gold rush. And Comstock Lode refers to the largest silver discovery, which happened in 1859, bringing settlers to Nevada. So this was one of the main motivating factors for bringing settlers out to the West, where they could work as miners, hoping to get rich quick. So what do gold and silver discoveries bring to the West? First of all, settlers helped make the Western territories into states by growing the population that was settled there. Second of all, they bring wealth. Obviously, gold and silver are being discovered. But also companies are moving there, towns are being settled there, goods are being sold there like they never were before. Industry comes to the West. Big mining companies moved in to make profit off of these precious metal discoveries. And also, the discovery of gold and silver made a need for railroads to extend out west. So we will see the growth of our railroad system in the years following the Civil War. So in 1865, the year that the Civil War ended, there were 35,000 miles of railroad track in the United States. Most of these tracks were east of the Mississippi. By the end of the century, 1900, there are 200,000 miles of railroad tracks. One of the goals after the Civil War was to build a transcontinental railroad, a railroad that connected the East Coast to the West Coast. So two companies were hired to build the Transcontinental Railroad, the Union Pacific and the Central Pacific. Both of these companies competed to get land and money, and they often relied on Irish and Chinese immigrants to do most of the hard labor for building these railroads. Specifically Chinese immigrants on the West Coast, because they had migrated here for opportunity to make a better life, and they were often used to work on the railroad. So we see here the Central Pacific Railroad began in California and extended into Utah, and the Union Pacific began in Nebraska, and they met in the middle. So, the place where the two tracks met each other, and thus the Transcontinental Railroad was completed, was Promontory Point, Utah in 1869. So just 4 years after the Civil War, the United States has its first Transcontinental Railroad, and the East Coast, or the West Coast, is connected to the various tracks located on the East Coast. At Promontory Point, you can see here where the two companies are meeting. There was a golden stripe. No, what is spike? Spike is the word that I'm looking for. That symbolized the completion of the Transcontinental Railroad. So the impact of the railroad, it stimulated the economy. Money was spent on steel, lumber, coal, all the things needed for a railroad. It connected the different regions of the United States. We see here where the Union Pacific started, it's already connected to all of these various tracks. So now more people can travel west without having to go in the traditional way that we learned about with wagons, which was a hard trip that took many months and where the settlers faced many hardships. Another way that people made money in the West and that brought a lot of settlers was through cattle. So the open range system referred to the fact that out in the West, specifically Texas, New Mexico, Oklahoma, property was not fenced in, so cattle could roam freely and graze on the grass. The way that people kept up with their cattle was by branding them with a specific brand. So at the end of the season, when the cattle needed to be sold to the slaughterhouses in the east, it was the job of cowboys to round up the cattle that belonged to a specific person and drive them north to be sold. So the open range system required the use of cowboys. So they would round up the cattle, take them north to be sold, and this was called the long drive. One of the most used trails was the Chisholm Trail, which went from Texas, we see the Chisholm Trail here, up into Abilene, Kansas. And that's where the railroad system was located, where they would load the cattle and send them a lot of times to Chicago, to the slaughterhouses, to be made into beef. So it took about 1 to 2 months to complete the journey of the Chisholm Trail. It was 1,500 miles. The cowboys are a quintessential American legend. However, the idea came from the Mexican vaqueros, who had done this for a long time, rounding up the cattle. They taught their ways to the American cowboy. The job was a hard job, it was dangerous, it was lonely, and it was low paying. So many of the ideas that we have about the cowboy are based in myth, not in fact. The heyday of the cowboy only lasted for about 20 years, and by the 1880s, railroad track extended into Texas, so there was no need for the long drive up to Kansas. The cattle could be loaded in Texas and sent from there. So here are some images of the cowboys. Obviously some of them are photographs. This would be the long drive herding the cattle north. And here's an image from popular memory. The place where the cowboys drove the cattle to became known as cow towns, and those are the small towns that we think of whenever we think of the Wild West with the saloons. It was the end point of the long drive where cowboys often blew off steam at the end of their hard 2 months of work. So this included places like Dodge City, Wichita, and Abilene, Kansas. These cow towns gave rise to legends like Wyatt Earp, Doc Holliday, Wild Bill Hickok, and Jesse James. And they were booming places until, obviously the cowboys were no longer needed and the long drive was done away with. I will include the link to this video, Gunfight at the OK Corral, which is an excerpt from the movie Tombstone, if you would like to see this famous scene that shows the cow towns. Most of these places did not have money to pay for a sheriff, so often justice was carried out by vigilantes. They were typically a pretty lawless place. The end of the open range obviously happened, like I said, whenever the railroad was extended into Texas. But it also happened with the invention of barbed wire. One of the reasons why cattle had roamed freely is because it was too expensive to fence in your entire amount of land. The barbed wire allowed for ranchers to cheaply fence off their land, so there was no need for them to graze freely and then for the cowboys to round them up. So the barbed wire is also the reason for the end of the open range and thus the end of the cowboy. So you should be familiar with the Homestead Act. It gave 160 acres of free land if the settlers agreed to live on it for at least 5 years and improve the land through cultivating the soil, planting crops, building a well, things like that. The Homestead Act also said that you could just immediately purchase the land for as low as $1.25 an acre, so a steal. So many people are going to be moving out west to become farmers on the Great Plains because of the Homestead Act. The Morrill Land Grant Act also provided money to states to build agricultural and technical colleges, so people could take this knowledge with them west. They would understand better how to farm and better agricultural practices. Many of you may be looking to go to North Carolina A&T whenever you graduate, and that was one of the colleges founded in North Carolina from Morrill Land Grant money. Exodusters were another population of people who moved west. These were African Americans who migrated from the South to the West after the Civil War. You should know from our discussion during the Reconstruction period why many of them would want to leave. They were escaping Jim Crow and violence from the Ku Klux Klan. If they moved out west, they could live on their own and make their own way, the way that many of the white settlers also wanted to do. Life on the Great Plains, though, was not awesome. We called the people who moved out to the Great Plains homesteaders because many of them took advantage of the Homestead Act. There were no trees out there to build houses from, so many lived in sod houses. We can see literally built from dirt and mud and grass. So not an ideal home, lots of bugs and critters. They faced difficult conditions and harsh weather. They lived usually right in the middle of Tornado Alley, lots of brutal storms, really hot in the summer, really cold in the winter. So, despite the fact that so many people moved out west for the Homestead Act to take advantage of that free land, only one of the 5 families that moved west stayed. If you also think about 160 acres of land that was all yours, your neighbors weren't close by, so it was just you and your family. It was super lonely, not a place that many people wanted to continue calling home. So we see the closing of the frontier in 1890. The last major land rush will occur in Oklahoma in 1889. Most of you know that Oklahoma was designated Indian Territory. Once all the rest of the West had been settled, we also opened up Oklahoma for settlement and relocated Native Americans to other places, forced them into smaller areas called reservations. So this gives us a couple of nicknames that we're already familiar with. Boomers were people who lined up on the border to stake their claims, waiting for Oklahoma Territory to officially open to try and get the best land. However, Sooners were people who had snuck in early and had already taken the best lands. That gives us the nickname the Sooners. In 1890, the American census conducted in that year determined that there was no more land in the United States that was not inhabited by white residents. And this is why we consider it the end of the frontier. The American West had been completely settled. We had achieved manifest destiny stretching from the Atlantic to the Pacific Oceans, and we had tamed the West.